Hi there, John Cress here, and I want to talk to you about a story that Jesus told from Luke 18. It's a simple story. It only has two main characters. The first character is a widow. Now in our culture, you can be a widow and be educated and wealthy and even own a business. It doesn't necessarily say anything about a person's status in society. However, in the Middle East culture, when Jesus told this story, the assumption would be that a widow was most likely poor, unemployable, devoid of power, status, and connections. The modern day equivalent would be a street person. So Jesus begins his story and he says, there was a widow, and the widow was being harassed by a local villain. Now the villain only plays a minor part in the plot, and the widow had no means to protect herself. She had no money, no connections, no status, no power, nowhere to turn for help. So the widow realizes that she has only one hope, one recourse, one shot to ward off this villain, and that is to go before the local judge and plead her case. Maybe the local judge will offer her protection from the villain who's harassing her. Enters the next second character, the local judge. He's described by Jesus in two statements in Luke. The first statement, the local judge had no fear of God. The second statement, he had no respect for human beings. Pretty scary description, wouldn't you say? No fear of God, no sense of moral absolutes, no sense of understanding that he himself would one day stand before the ultimate judge and give account for the judgments he was making from his bench. He doesn't care a whit about God. He doesn't care a whit about human beings. Translated, it means he was free in his spirit to use and abuse people who came into his courtroom. Because frankly, my dear, he didn't give a hoot. So do you have that picture in your mind? A poor, oppressed widow at wit's end. Her only hope is to come before a judge who has no fear of God and doesn't care about human beings. She's going to plead her case, and he's going to hear her case. What do you think's going to happen? You're probably thinking, I don't like the way this is shaping up. She throws herself on the mercy of the court. She says, Judge, I don't want favors. I just want my rights as a human citizen of this town. I have nowhere else to turn. You're my only hope. Please, Judge, please stop this villain who's harassing me. And as you might have guessed, the crooked judge looks down and gets a good laugh and says, who needs to bother with this belly-aching street lady? Get her out of here. Throw her out on the street. So the widow rides up, thrown out on the street, out of the court. She gathers herself up and thinks about her situation, and with wartime resolve, she says to herself, I have no other options. I have no husband to protect me. I have no relatives to help me. I have no power to wield, no money to hire an attorney, no connections to tap into. This judge is my only hope. Somehow I have to get him to offer me protection from my opponent. So she thinks to herself, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to annoy this judge. I'm going to pester this judge. I'm going to bother this judge until he offers me protection, puts me in jail, or kills me. Every time this judge turns around, I'm going to be right there in his face. I'm going to be his worst nightmare. I'm going to bug him to the point where he honors my request, or he puts a pair of cement slippers on my feet and walks me down to the river. So she does just that. Day in and day out, week in and week out, she's in this judge's face, pleading and pestering. And guess what? It works. She pesters the judge into submission. In my own mind, I imagine him storming out of his office one day, screaming to his underlings, will somebody take care of this woman? I can't take it anymore. I don't care what it costs. She's pestering me into insanity. I can't live like this anymore. Fix her problem. So the happy ending to the story is that the crooked, uncaring judge finally gives protection to this widow because of her extraordinary ability to pester. So the moral of the story is what? It pays to pester. That may be the only way you get what you need from someone who is not willing to grant it to you, right? However, remember that Jesus told this story in order to motivate people to pray. And so over the years, people have read Luke 18 in a genuine attempt to understand this story in a way that will improve their motivation about praying. So after doing a little thinking about the story, some start to think like this. What does this story mean? Like, what was Jesus driving at? Okay, let me think. The story is an allegory, right? which means we're like the widow. We're like the widow, weak and powerless, no status, no connections to anybody, abandoned, hopeless. We're all facing terrible challenges and problems and difficulties in our lives that we just can't handle alone. So we have to speak to somebody above, and God's like the judge in the story. Well, not exactly, but sort of close enough. I mean, he's busy, he's got planets to spin and hearts to keep tuned, and besides, there's a lot of people, men with many needs, coming to him all the time. I better not bother him unless it's very important. But if it's extremely important, if I have a real need to capture his attention, I'll do whatever it takes like the widow did. I'll pester him. I'll start banging on the doors of heaven. I'll start pushing my knees into the concrete. I'll call all my friends and coordinate a corporate pestering attack. Sooner or later, we'll manage to wrench a blessing from the closed hands of a God who doesn't want to give it to us. Sooner or later, God will shout, "I can't take it anymore. Gabriel, Michael, fix this man's problem. Fix this woman's problem." Are you buying all of this? I think a lot of people do. I've talked to people who don't pray, and they say, "I don't have the energy to do what it takes to get a response from heaven." Prayer, they say, just wears me out. But remember, Jesus told this story to motivate people to pray. In fact, at the end of the story, he says something interesting that tips us off to what the story is really all about. He says, "Now shall not God bring about justice for his people, who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will bring about justice for them speedily." Which tips us off that this story is not an allegory. Rather, it is a skillfully designed, cleverly communicated study in contrast. In other words, Jesus wanted his listeners, after he told the story, to have a light go on in their mind and to say to themselves, wait a minute, maybe what Jesus was saying is that we're not like the widow. In fact, maybe we're totally unlike her. Maybe we're the opposite from the widow. The widow was forgotten and abandoned. No connections, no relationship with the judge. However, if we are in a relationship with Jesus, we are in the family of God. We're not forgotten, abandoned, hopeless, without connections. We are sons and daughters of God. We're in a favored position before God. We are totally unlike the widow. And that's the point that Jesus was making. You're not just another face in an overcrowded courtroom. You're not a bother to the Father. You're not just a number. You are part of the family. Don't ever decide not to pray because you think that you're penniless, powerless, nameless, faceless, and forgotten people, because that's not who you are in God's sight. You have connections to the Father, a family connection. The fact is, and let this sink in, because if you do, it will motivate you to pray. No one's voice sounds like your voice to God. No one's voice. Are you able to let that sink in? You matter to God. In Christ, you're in favored position in the family of God. You have direct, private access. No one's voice is sweeter to God than your voice. Anytime, anywhere, about anything. He loves to hear from you. In fact, I think he's calling out your name right now.